First story, The Whisper of Blackwood. I moved to Blackwood in early October, searching for peace. The kind of peace that only a town tucked away in the mountains of Vermont could provide. After my nervous breakdown, years of chasing scandalous stories in crowded cities, I needed quiet. The doctors called it burnout. I called it suffocation. So, when I found the listing for a small cabin in Blackwood, it felt like an escape. Blackwood wasn't much to look at. A few wooden houses scattered across narrow roads, surrounded by towering pine trees. The kind of place where people waved to each other from their porches. And the biggest news of the day was if the mail came late. I thought it was perfect, but that was before the whispers started on my second night. I had barely unpacked when I heard it, faint at first, drifting through my open window. A voice, maybe several, murmuring just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was the wind cutting through the thick branches of the forest. But there was a cadence to it, a rhythm that didn't belong to nature. I tried to sleep, but the whispers crept into my mind. When I went outside the next morning, groggy from lack of rest, I asked my neighbor about it. A woman in her 50s named Margaret who lived just down the dirt road. Her face went pale the moment I mentioned the whispers. Best to keep your windows closed at night, dear. The forest here, it carries sounds in strange ways, she said, eyes shifting toward the trees. Her answer was evasive, and something in her voice unsettled me. But I dropped it, convincing myself it was just my imagination, the remnants of the city stress clinging to my mind. I kept busy during the day, walking through the village, interviewing locals for what was supposed to be a light piece about small-town life. But everyone avoided talking about the forest. Whenever I brought it up, conversations ended abruptly, eyes darted nervously, and excuses were made. The children, though, they were different. They didn't hide their fear. When I mentioned the forest to a group of them playing near the old church, one of the younger ones, a boy named Tommy, said, "She takes the ones who ask too much." The others hushed him immediately, but my curiosity was piqued. I asked Tommy later what he meant. "The woman of the mist," he whispered, his eyes wide and unblinking. "She's in the woods. She watches. If you hear her whisper, you shouldn't listen. But if you ask about her, she'll come for you." I laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to childish ghost stories. But the whispers, they got louder. By the fourth night, I could make out distinct voices. They were clearer, though not enough to understand what they were saying. They seemed to be calling, but to whom? I'd lie in bed, heart racing, the sound pressing in through the walls of my cabin. I started waking up drenched in sweat, feeling like I wasn't alone, like something was watching from the trees. Couldn't let it go. The journalist in me took over. I began digging into the town's history, combing through old records at the library and interviewing anyone who was willing to talk, which wasn't many. The further I dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. Every few decades, someone disappeared. Sometimes it was a traveler passing through. Sometimes it was a local, always without a trace. The deeper I went, the more the townsfolk avoided me. Margaret stopped answering my knocks, and even the children crossed the street when they saw me coming. I became an outsider, an intruder prying into things better left alone. It was late October when I decided to enter the forest. I don't know what I was expecting to find, maybe some rational explanation for the whispers, but as I crossed into the shadowy woods, the air felt heavier. The further I walked, the more the trees seemed to close in on me, their branches twisting unnaturally overhead. I came across strange markings carved into the trunks, symbols that sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. And then I felt it, a presence just out of sight, like eyes following me from the shadows. I wasn't alone. I pressed on until the whispers returned, this time louder, almost frantic. They weren't coming from one direction, but from all around me, circling me. The voices, they were crying for help. I heard names, faint and fleeting, as if being carried on the wind. Sarah, Jonathan, David, it was then that I saw her, a figure cloaked in mist, gliding between the trees. Her face was obscured, but I knew it was her, the woman of the mist. My legs froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I stood there, staring as she approached. The air turned frigid, and with a voice like 1,000 echoes, she spoke. "They are trapped, caught between your world and mine." I tried to move, to speak, but I couldn't. She drifted closer, her form shifting in the fog, and whispered, "You know too much. You cannot leave." I don't remember how I escaped the forest. One moment I was standing in front of her, the next I was stumbling through the underbrush, gasping for air as the trees thinned. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin, locking the door behind me. I packed my things that night, determined to leave Blackwood. I tried to write down everything I had discovered, to send it to my editor, but every time I sat down at my laptop, my thoughts scattered. The words wouldn't come, and then my voice, it's gone. Not just my ability to write, my actual voice. I tried to speak this morning, to call for help, but no sound escaped my throat. I can still hear the whispers, louder than ever now, seeping through the walls. They are calling for me, calling me to join them. I know what's happening. I'm becoming one of them. If you find this, if you hear the whispers, don't follow them. Don't ask. Don't investigate, or you'll become one of the lost too. And soon you'll hear my voice among them. Second story, the last house on Hollow Street. I never knew my grandparents very well. They lived in a tiny, forgotten town called Hollow Ridge, a place I'd only visited once as a kid. When they passed away, it wasn't a huge shock. Grandpa had been sick for years, and Grandma followed him not long after. What was strange, though, was the house. They left it to me in their will, no questions asked, as if it was always meant to be mine. I hadn't thought about Hollow Ridge in years, but the idea of starting fresh in a new place after everything I'd been through, losing my job, a messy breakup, was too tempting to ignore. So, I packed my things and drove down to the old house at the end of Hollow Street. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. The house itself was a relic of the past, a two-story Victorian with peeling paint and ivy crawling up its walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the trees that lined the street loomed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to follow me wherever I went. But it wasn't the house that unnerved me. It was the people. Hollow Ridge was small, so small that everyone knew everyone. And from the moment I stepped out of my car, I felt their eyes on me. The neighbors, all of them, stared as I carried boxes inside. They didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched. It was as though they were waiting for something. At first, I told myself it was just a small town thing. Maybe they weren't used to outsiders. But as days went by, their behavior only got stranger. No matter where I went, the grocery store, the post office, people stared, whispered. It was like they were keeping tabs on me, monitoring my every move. At night, I'd glance out the window and catch glimpses of figures standing on the sidewalk, just beyond the circle of light from the street lamps, watching my house, watching me. One evening, while clearing out the attic, I stumbled upon a collection of old journals. They belonged to my grandmother. Curious, I sat down in the dust and began to read. At first, the entries were mundane, talk of the weather, daily chores, how Grandpa was doing. But then, the tone shifted. She started writing about the town, about the people. She described a group, more like a secret society that controlled everything in Hollow Ridge. They weren't just influential, they were feared. The entries grew darker as she wrote about the rituals. Apparently, every few years, the town would hold a ceremony, a gathering in the woods just beyond the ridge. These rituals, she claimed, were meant to ensure the town's prosperity. Good harvests, economic stability, even the health of the people. But there was always a price, a sacrifice, and that's when I noticed the dates. The last few rituals matched the dates of major events in my family's history, deaths, illnesses, even the sudden, unexplained disappearance of my uncle decades ago. I felt my heart pound as I read her final entry. She knew. My grandmother knew that the town had marked someone in our family for sacrifice. She didn't name names, but it was clear she was terrified. Her writing became frantic, the words shaky, as if she knew what was coming for her and my grandfather. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me to pack my bags and go. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more I needed to understand. I wanted answers. I needed to know what had really happened to my grandparents. The following night, I attended a town meeting. I'd heard whispers about it and decided it was my chance to confront them, to get the truth. When I arrived, the atmosphere was suffocating. The town's elders sat at the front of the room, their eyes cold and calculating, as if they already knew why I was there. I didn't hold back. I asked them about the rituals, about my grandparents, about the sacrifices. The room fell deathly silent. Then one of the elders, an old man with sharp features and a voice like gravel, spoke. "We all pay a price, Emily," he said, "for the good of the town, your family." They understood that. I felt my stomach drop. The room seemed to close in around me as I realized the full weight of what he was saying. My grandparents hadn't died from illness. They'd been taken, sacrificed, and now it was my turn. I left the meeting in a daze, the weight of their stares burning into my back. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing footsteps outside the house, whispers carried on the wind. Around midnight, I decided I couldn't stay another second. I packed a bag and headed for the door, but when I stepped outside, they were waiting. The entire town, dozens of them, stood in the street, blocking my escape. Their eyes were hollow, lifeless, as if they were no longer fully human. In their hands, they held torches, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across their faces. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. I knew what was coming. I tried to run, but they closed in, surrounding me in a tight circle. I screamed for help, but no one outside of Hollow Ridge would hear me. No one would care. As they began chanting low, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, like they were pulling the very life out of me. The world began to blur around the edges, the trees and houses dissolving into darkness. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, my vision narrowing as the chanting grew louder, more intense. The last thing I remember is their faces, blank, expressionless, staring down at me as the darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I never will, but the town of Hollow Ridge still stands. The crops are still bountiful, the businesses thriving, the people healthy. And the last house on Hollow Street remains empty, waiting for the next name to be called. Third story, the host of Willard Creek. When Sarah and I first arrived in Willard Creek, it felt like we'd stepped into a postcard. The kind of place where life slows down, where people greet you with a smile, and everything seems simple, untouched by the chaos of the world outside. That's what we needed, what she needed, after everything we'd been through. Losing the baby, it had shattered us. So when I found this place, far from the city and the memories, it seemed like fate. The villagers were welcoming, almost too much so. They were eager to help us settle in, offering fresh bread, vegetables, even furniture. They seemed genuinely happy we were there, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something beneath the surface, something they weren't saying. But I brushed it off. We needed this fresh start. Sarah needed it more than anyone. First, things seemed to be getting better. Sarah smiled again, something I hadn't seen in months. The house, tucked near the edge of the woods, became our refuge. But it wasn't long before the dream started. She didn't tell me right away. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find her sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the dark forest, her face pale, her body tense. When I'd ask what was wrong, she'd shake her head and mutter something about nightmares. I figured it was the trauma of the miscarriage, grief manifesting in her sleep. But the dreams grew worse. Sarah started talking about children. At first, it was vague, just the shadowy figures of kids lost in the woods, their voices echoing in the trees. But soon, the dreams became more vivid. She said she could see their faces, hear their cries. She told me their clothes looked old, like something from decades past. And always, they were trying to lead her deeper into the woods. I didn't know what to do. She was spiraling again, and I felt powerless. But when I mentioned it to the locals, hoping someone could offer support or advice, their reactions were strange. They grew quiet, eyes darting around nervously. They'd quickly change the subject, sometimes even walking away abruptly. It was the local grocer, Mrs. Calloway, who finally let something slip. "There's no need to go looking into things that don't concern you," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp. "Not everything needs remembering." That night, Sarah woke me up, trembling. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I think they're real. They're lost, and no one cares." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was all just dreams. But something in her eyes stopped me. There was a desperation, a belief that chilled me to my core. And then, a few weeks later, Sarah found out she was pregnant again. I thought it would be a blessing, a chance for redemption, a way to heal. But that's when everything changed. The villagers, once warm and welcoming, became strange. They stopped by more often, lingering around the house, always asking about Sarah's pregnancy. At first, it was innocent enough, concerned neighbors checking in. But then it became intrusive. They'd bring strange gifts, herbs, talismans, things that made no sense to me. And they'd talk about the baby like it wasn't ours. "The child belongs to Willard Creek," one of the men said one evening when we were walking through the village square. I laughed it off, thinking he meant the community would help us raise it. But the way he looked at me, cold and expectant, sent a shiver down my spine. Sarah was noticing it too. People would touch her belly without asking, their hands lingering too long. They spoke in whispers when they thought she wasn't listening, muttering about the host and the offering. She began locking the doors and windows, even during the day, insisting she didn't feel safe. Then one night, she woke me up in a panic. "Jake," she gasped, clutching her belly, "it's too soon. Something's wrong." I rushed her to the car, but before I could start the engine, a group of villagers appeared in the driveway, blocking our path. "She needs to come with us," Mrs. Calloway said, her voice steady and eerily calm. "No," I snapped. "We're going to the hospital," but the crowd wouldn't budge. "The baby isn't yours to take," she continued, her eyes dark and cold. "It belongs here, with us." Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of what was happening. These people weren't just eccentric, they were dangerous. And Sarah was in labor, her pain intensifying by the second. "Take her to the cabin," one of the men said. "It's where it's always been done." I had no choice. They forced us toward a small, dilapidated cabin deep in the woods, a place I hadn't even known existed. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, old, faded drawings of children and something else. A creature, its form grotesque and twisted, looming over the figures of infants. Sarah was screaming by this point, her hands gripping mine so tightly I thought she'd break my fingers. "Don't let them take him," she sobbed. "Jake, please." I was ready to fight, to drag her out of there. But then I saw something. In the shadows of the room, something moved. A figure barely visible but unmistakably real. It was the thing from Sarah's nightmares, the monstrous form she had described in such detail. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, locked onto her. That's when I understood. The villagers, they weren't just some backwoods cult. They were caretakers of something ancient, something evil, and they needed our baby. But I couldn't let that happen. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed Sarah, pulling her toward the door. The villagers tried to stop us, but I fought them off, somehow managing to get her back to the car. We sped through the woods, her screams filling the air, until finally, we made it to the nearest hospital miles away. The doctors said it was a miracle she and the baby survived. But I knew better. This wasn't over. In the days that followed, I started noticing it. The way the baby looked at me, his eyes too dark, too aware. His skin, once soft and pink, began to change, becoming pale and wrong. He wouldn't cry like a normal infant. Instead, at night, he'd make these strange, guttural sounds just like the thing in the cabin. I don't know what they did to him, what it is, but I know one thing for sure. The villagers of Willard Creek got what they wanted. The baby, he isn't ours. Not anymore. And every day, I can see it more clearly. The host is growing stronger. Fourth story, the lights of Ridgeview. I've spent my whole life trying to forget what happened that summer in 1987. But no matter how hard I try, the memories always creep back in. Sometimes it's in dreams, other times in random flashes of light that remind me of them. I'm writing this now because I know it's time to go back. But before I do, I need to tell you what happened. Back then, Ridgeview was a quiet little village in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless fields and thick woods. There wasn't much to do for a group of teenagers looking for excitement, except to tell and retell the old local legends. The biggest one was always about the lights. Strange, glowing orbs that hovered over the hills just outside of town, usually on the darkest nights. People talked about them like they were some harmless curiosity, something to entertain tourists or scare little kids. But the thing is, no one ever really knew what the lights were. They just showed up without warning and then vanished just as quickly. Some said it was swamp gas, others said they were UFOs. The more superstitious folks whispered about spirits, souls of the dead trapped on the hill. None of us believed that, of course. We were kids. We thought we were invincible. So one hot summer night, we decided to camp out on Ridgeview Hill to see the lights for ourselves. There were 6 of us, me, Rachel, my boyfriend Greg, his best friend Paul, and 2 other girls, Jenna and Lisa. We packed up some tents, grabbed a couple of flashlights, and hiked up the hill just before sunset. The hill was steep, and by the time we reached the top, the sun was just a faint orange line on the horizon. We set up our tents, started a small fire, and sat around laughing, telling dumb stories, waiting for the lights to appear. For a while, it was fun. The air was warm, and the stars were starting to come out. I remember thinking that maybe the stories were all just a joke, that we'd sit there all night and see nothing. But then, right around midnight, the air got cold. Not just a breeze, but a sudden, bone-chilling cold that felt completely out of place for a summer night. We all noticed it, and for a second, the laughter died. That's when Paul spotted the first one. "There," he said, pointing toward the horizon. We all turned and saw it. A soft, bluish light hovering just above the tree line, bobbing slowly back and forth. Then another one appeared, and another. Soon, there were at least 5 or 6 of them, floating silently in the distance. We were mesmerized. At first, it was kind of beautiful, like watching fireflies. Greg was the first to get up, joking that he was going to catch one. We laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. He started walking toward the lights, but they didn't stay put. The closer he got, the further they moved, almost like they were playing with him. "Come on, Greg. Don't be stupid," Jenna called, but he just waved her off. I could see the look in his eyes, half excited, half challenging. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. As Greg kept walking, the lights began to change. What had been soft, glowing orbs started to shift, becoming sharper, brighter, and closer. I don't know how to explain it, but they didn't just move toward us. They shifted like they were suddenly everywhere at once. The temperature dropped again, even colder this time. I started to feel something else, something wrong. Paul, Jenna, and Lisa were already backing up toward the tents. "Greg!" I shouted, but by then it was too late. The lights weren't just lights anymore. They were alive, circling around him like they were hunting. I could hear Greg yelling, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. His voice sounded distorted, like it was being pulled through water. He turned to run back, but the lights followed, faster now. And then one of them shot forward, enveloping him in this blinding, blue-white flash. I remember screaming, but my voice felt small, insignificant. Greg was gone just like that. 1 minute he was there, the next, nothing. No body, no sound, just gone. The others panicked, running in every direction. Paul tripped and fell, his screams echoing into the night as the lights swarmed him next. I saw Jenna and Lisa disappear into the trees, but I knew they wouldn't make it far. The lights were everywhere now, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights turned on me. I remember feeling this intense pressure, like they were pulling at my very soul. The last thing I remember from that night is collapsing to the ground, my head spinning as the lights swirled above me. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining, and the air was warm again. The campsite was empty. No tents, no backpacks, nothing. Just me lying on the ground, alone. I made my way back to Ridgeview in a daze. When I got there, no one believed me. Not about the lights, not about what happened to the others. The police searched the hill, but they found no trace of them. No bodies, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. It was like they never existed. I tried to move on with my life after that, but the nightmares never stopped. The lights, they haunt me even now. I know they're waiting, watching, and I know what they are. They're not some harmless mystery or tourist attraction. They're something much worse. It's been over 30 years, and I've kept quiet. I tried to forget, but I can't. The guilt of being the only one who made it out has been eating me alive. That's why I'm going back tonight. I need to see the lights one last time to understand why I was spared. As I write this, I'm standing at the foot of Ridgeview Hill, the same spot where it all started. The sun is setting, and the air is starting to cool. I can already see the first light flickering in the distance, calling me back. I know what's coming. This time I won't run. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Maybe I'm with them now, part of the lights just like Greg, Paul, Jenna, and Lisa. And if you ever find yourself in Ridgeview, looking up at the hill on a dark night, do yourself a favor. Stay away from the lights. Fifth story, Shadows on Coldwater Lake. When we first arrived at Coldwater, it felt like a dream come true. The small village nestled by the clear, still lake seemed like the perfect place to raise our family. The house we'd found was charming, with a big yard and a breathtaking view of the water. For years, Mike and I had dreamed of a place like this where our two kids, Ben and Lily, could grow up surrounded by nature. Lily, our youngest, loved it from the start. She spent hours playing by the shore, building little castles out of sand and rocks. Ben was a bit older, more skeptical, but even he couldn't resist the pull of the lake. Coldwater had this tranquil quality, as if time moved slower there. The first time we noticed something strange, it was just after sunset. Mike and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sky fade into twilight, when I saw it, dark shapes, just barely visible, moving near the water's edge. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe just the trees casting long shadows across the shore. But as I squinted, I saw them again. They were there, lingering by the water, shifting and swaying like they were waiting for something. "I think there's someone down by the lake," I told Mike, my voice catching in my throat. He looked up, frowning, and scanned the shore. "I don't see anything," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The lake was beautiful during the day, but as soon as dusk settled in, it changed. Those dark figures appeared more frequently, always near the water, always just out of reach. One night, as I was tucking Lily into bed, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. "Mommy," she said. her voice soft and dreamy. "The friends from the lake are coming again tonight." I froze. "What friends, sweetie?" "The ones that play with me by the water," she said, her eyes wide and innocent. "They come at night when you're asleep. They're really nice. They told me they live in the lake." I tried to stay calm. "Lily, what do these friends look like?" "They look like me," she said simply, "but they're wet. Their clothes are all wet." I kissed her goodnight, my mind racing. Wet clothes, friends from the lake. It had to be her imagination, right? But still, something about the way she said it, so matter of fact, unnerved me. The next morning, I mentioned it to one of the locals, an older woman who had lived in Coldwater her entire life. She gave me a strange look and leaned in closer. "Has anyone told you about the accident?" she asked quietly. I shook my head, and she continued, her voice low and cautious. "Years ago, there was a terrible tragedy on Coldwater Lake. A group of children were out on a boat, summer camp, I think it was. There was a storm and the boat overturned. Most of them drowned. The bodies were never recovered. I felt a chill run down my spine. People say the lake, it never gave them back. Some of the old-timers believe their spirits are still out there, trapped in the water." She glanced at the lake as if afraid it might be listening. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house making me jump. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft splash, followed by what sounded like whispering outside. I crept to the window, my heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain just a crack. There they were, the figures more distinct now, standing at the edge of the lake. They looked like children, their small frames silhouetted against the moonlit water. But something was wrong. Their movements were slow, unnatural, as if they were struggling to stand. I watched in horror as they began to move toward the house, their eyes fixed on the windows. I rushed to Lily's room, terrified of what I might find. She was sitting up in bed, her little face glowing with excitement. "They're here," she whispered. "My friends." I pulled her close, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "We're leaving, Lily. We're leaving tomorrow." But it was already too late. The next day, Mike and I packed up as fast as we could. We didn't tell the kids why, just that it was time to go. But as night fell and the house grew dark, the sense of dread became unbearable. We had planned to leave at first light, but something kept gnawing at me, urging me to leave now. It was around midnight when the figures came again, this time closer than ever. From the window, I could see them emerging from the lake, their bodies dripping with water, their faces pale and empty. They moved silently, their feet barely touching the ground as they approached the house. I shook Mike awake, but when we turned to grab Lily from her bed, she was gone. We ran outside, frantic, searching the yard, calling her name. Then I saw her, by the shore, standing knee-deep in the water. She was smiling, talking to someone, though I couldn't see who. Mike screamed her name, but she didn't move. The shadows surrounded her, their arms reaching out, pulling her deeper into the lake. We sprinted toward her, our feet slipping on the wet grass. By the time we reached the shore, the water had swallowed her up to her waist. I saw them then, the children. Their faces were bloated, pale, their eyes dark pits of emptiness. They clung to Lily, pulling her gently, almost lovingly, into the water. "Lily, come back," I screamed, but my voice sounded so distant, like it was being drowned out by the lake itself. She turned and looked at me, her eyes wide and innocent, as if she didn't understand why we were so afraid. "They just want to play, Mommy," she said softly, her voice carrying over the water. "I'm going with them," and then she was gone. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed her was the water closing over her head, her small figure disappearing beneath the surface, hand in hand with the shadows of Coldwater Lake. We never found her. Sixth story, the Ashwood Pact. I wasn't expecting anything extraordinary when I moved to Ashwood. As a professor of environmental science, I had spent years studying strange weather phenomena, but the reports about this little village in North Carolina piqued my curiosity. While surrounding towns were battered by floods, storms, and all kinds of natural disasters, Ashwood remained untouched, as if it was immune. It felt like a small, isolated paradise, and I wanted to understand why. My wife, Rachel, wasn't as enthusiastic about the move. She found the village too quiet, too old-fashioned. But for me, it was perfect. A chance to study an anomaly in peace, away from the noise of the city. And at first, everything seemed fine. The villagers were polite, if a little distant. They kept to themselves, but I figured that was normal for a place like Ashwood. But then I started digging. I came to study the microclimate, but as I settled into my research, I realized something was off. The patterns didn't make sense. There was no scientific reason why Ashwood should be spared the storms that ravaged the surrounding areas. Meteorological models showed no anomaly, no logical explanation for the phenomenon. So I began asking questions. First, simple ones. I'd visit the village elders, mostly just to get a sense of the local history. But whenever I brought up the village's strange immunity to disaster, their expressions would darken, and they'd change the subject. "It's just luck," they'd say, or "We've always been blessed." But there was something in their eyes, fear, maybe, or guilt, something they weren't saying. The more I asked, the more people avoided me. Conversations would stop abruptly as I approached, and polite smiles would turn to frowns. Rachel noticed it too. "Maybe you should back off a little," she suggested one evening, her voice uneasy. "People here are different. They don't like outsiders asking too many questions." But I couldn't let it go. There was something strange about Ashwood, something that went beyond just the weather. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I stumbled upon a reference to the founding of the village. Hidden deep in the town's library, in a book so old its pages were brittle, I found a passage that chilled me to the bone. It spoke of a pact made by the original settlers, a bargain struck with an entity deep in the earth. In exchange for the village's safety, there was a price to be paid. The details were vague, but the meaning was clear. Ashwood's protection wasn't natural. It was earned through sacrifice. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It sounded like some ancient myth or legend, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The way the older villagers avoided talking about the town's past, the odd reverence they had for the land, and the strange rituals I'd occasionally see them performing at the local church. It all pointed to something dark lurking beneath the surface. I confronted one of the oldest villagers, an 80-year-old man named Walter, about the pact. At first, he refused to speak, but as I pressed him, his face twisted in a mix of fear and anger. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "Some things are better left alone. You don't know what you're messing with." That night, I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the whole village was closing in around me. Rachel noticed it too. She woke up in the middle of the night, pale and shaking. "I heard something outside," she said. It sounded like voices, whispering. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was, I was scared too. The whispers, the strange behavior of the villagers, the old legends, it was all starting to make sense. Too much sense. The next day, I went to the church. It was an old building, probably the oldest in Ashwood, with thick stone walls and a steeple that loomed over the village. Inside, it was dark and musty, lit only by a few flickering candles. At the back, behind the altar, I found a door. It was locked, but I managed to pry it open with a crowbar I'd brought, my heart racing the whole time. What I found behind that door will haunt me for the rest of my life. There was a staircase leading down into the earth, and at the bottom, a cavern. The air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in strange markings. Symbols I didn't recognize, but that radiated malevolence. In the center of the room was an altar, old and stained with something dark. And behind it, carved into the stone, were the words that confirmed my worst fears. One life for another, one soul for safety. The pact was real. I ran out of the church, my heart pounding in my chest, and hurried home. I needed to get Rachel and leave now, but it was too late. When I got back to the house, they were waiting for me. A group of villagers, including Walter, stood at the door. Behind them, the sky was dark, thick clouds rolling in, the wind picking up. The storm was coming. Walter stepped forward, his eyes cold. "You had to know," he said, shaking his head. "You had to ask questions. The pact must be kept." I tried to run, to fight, but there were too many of them. They grabbed me, tied my hands, and dragged me back to the church. Rachel screamed, trying to stop them, but they held her back. As they forced me down the stairs and into the cavern, I realized what was happening. I was the sacrifice. I struggled, begged, but it didn't matter. They laid me on the altar, chanting in that strange, guttural language, their voices rising as the storm outside grew louder. I could hear the wind howling, the rain pounding against the earth. But here, deep below Ashwood, everything was eerily calm. And then I saw it. Something moving in the shadows, something vast and ancient, its presence filling the cavern with a crushing weight. It was the entity, the thing they had made the pact with, and it had come for its due. As they chanted, I felt it reaching for me, pulling me down, down into the earth. The last thing I remember is the sound of the storm fading, the voices of the villagers growing distant as the darkness swallowed me whole. The next morning, Ashwood was untouched by the storm. The surrounding towns were devastated, flooded, homes destroyed, power lines down. But Ashwood stood, pristine and safe. Rachel left that day. She didn't speak to anyone, just packed her things and drove away. As for me, I'm still here, deep beneath the village, a part of the earth now, a part of the pact. Ashwood remains safe, but only for now. Seventh story, The Watchers of Pine Hollow. When my family moved to Pine Hollow, Maine, I thought it would be just another small, quiet town, far removed from the chaos of city life. My parents had always dreamed of living somewhere remote, somewhere where they could breathe, as they put it. I wasn't thrilled about the move. At 17, leaving my friends behind for a town with more trees than people felt like a punishment. But Pine Hollow was different from other small towns, and it wasn't long before I realized how wrong I was about that place. It started on our second night. The house was old, like everything in Pine Hollow, with creaky floorboards and windows that didn't quite seal against the chill. After unpacking most of the day, I went outside to get some air. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shapes, tall, unmoving figures standing at the top of the hills surrounding the village. They looked like silhouettes against the fading light, almost like the shadows of people, but too still, too perfect. I squinted, trying to make out more detail, but they were just far enough away that I couldn't see faces, if they even had any. I went back inside and mentioned it to my parents. They just laughed it off, saying my eyes were playing tricks on me, that I was tired from the move. But the next morning, I overheard a conversation at the local diner. An older woman was whispering to her friend, something about the Watchers. "Don't look at them too long," she said. "That's how they notice you." It didn't take long for me to realize that Pine Hollow had a secret. The townspeople didn't like to talk about the figures on the hills, but they all believed in them. They had rules, unspoken but understood. You don't leave your house after dark. You don't talk about the figures. And above all, you don't try to get close to them. My parents, being the practical people they are, dismissed all of it as small-town superstition. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every night, I would look out my bedroom window and see them, those tall, looming figures always watching, always in the same place. Sometimes there were just 2 or 3. Other nights, there were a dozen or more, like an audience waiting for something to happen. I started having nightmares, terrible dreams where the figures weren't just on the hills. They were inside the house, standing over my bed, reaching for me with impossibly long fingers. I told my parents, but they insisted it was just stress from the move. I wanted to believe them, but I couldn't. The nightmares felt too real. And then, the figures started moving. It was subtle at first. They would shift just slightly, as if they were getting ready to take a step forward. But over the next few days, they crept closer. No one else seemed to notice. The figures never appeared during the day, and by night, the townspeople shut their doors, pulled their curtains, and pretended the hills were empty. But I saw them. One night, after another sleepless stretch, I woke to find one of the figures standing at the edge of our yard, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was closer than I had ever seen before, close enough to see that its face was featureless, a blank, smooth surface like clay. I stared at it, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely breathe. Then it turned its head toward me. I screamed. My parents rushed in, but when they looked out the window, there was nothing there. They assured me I was dreaming, but I knew what I saw. And worse, I knew they were getting closer. The next day, I tried asking around about the Watchers. Most people shut down immediately, their faces tightening at the mere mention of them. But one man, old and hunched, muttered something before hurrying off. "They've always been there," he said. "They watch because they know what's coming." That night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront them, whatever they were. I didn't tell my parents. There was no point. They wouldn't believe me. So, just after midnight, I slipped out of the house and started walking toward the hills. The closer I got, the harder it was to breathe, like the air itself was resisting me. I could see them clearly now, tall, inhumanly thin figures, standing like sentinels at the top of the hill. As I approached, I expected them to disappear, like a mirage, but they didn't. They just stood there, waiting. When I finally reached them, I realized something I hadn't expected. They weren't there to harm us. They were warnings. I don't know how I knew, but the moment I stepped into their circle, it was like a wave of understanding washed over me. They were visions of the future, projections of something terrible that was about to happen. Pine Hollow wasn't safe. These figures, these Watchers, had been there for generations, trying to warn the town of a disaster that was coming, one that couldn't be stopped. I tried to run back to the house to warn my parents, but when I turned around, I saw them. The figures had followed me, not just on the hills anymore. They were in the streets, in the yards, surrounding the village like a dark cloud. As I ran, I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around my chest. No matter how fast I moved, I couldn't outrun them. By the time I reached my house, one of them was already there, standing in front of the door. It reached out, its long fingers brushing my arm, and in that moment, everything went cold. My vision blurred, and it felt like I was being pulled apart, like I was disappearing. I screamed for my parents, but they didn't hear me. I pounded on the door, but it was like I wasn't even there. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went black. I don't know how long I was gone. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining, and the Watchers were gone. But something was different. I ran inside to find my parents, to tell them what had happened. But when I called out to them, they looked at me with blank, confused expressions. "Claire?" my mother asked, frowning. "Who's Claire?" That's when I realized. They didn't remember me. It was like I had never existed. My room was still there, but my things were gone. My parents went about their day as if I had never been their daughter, as if I had never lived in that house. And as I stood there, feeling the weight of their absence, I understood the final truth. The Watchers didn't just warn of the future, they erased those they marked. I'm writing this now while I still can, because soon I'll be gone completely. The Watchers have taken me, just like they've taken others before me, and Pine Hollow will continue, oblivious to the danger that lurks on the hills. If you ever find yourself in Pine Hollow, remember, don't look at them, don't follow them, and above all, never forget that some warnings come too late, because once they've seen you, it's already over. 8th story, The Song of the Lost Village. I've been driving trucks for nearly 25 years, and I thought I'd seen just about everything out on the open road. You'd be surprised what people leave behind on old, forgotten highways. Abandoned gas stations, crumbling motels, small towns that be slowly bled dry as the world passed them by. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found deep in the hills of Kentucky. Or I guess I should say, for what found me. It was supposed to be a routine haul, a straight shot through the back roads, nothing unusual. But somewhere I took a wrong turn. My GPS cut out, and the road signs became sparse, weathered to the point of being unreadable. I figured I'd just find the next town, stop, and ask for directions like the old days. But after miles of driving, the landscape around me grew more desolate. Forests closed in, the trees thick and ancient, like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. That's when I saw it, the village. There were no signs leading to it, no lights, no cars. Just a cluster of old wooden houses that seemed to grow out of the landscape. I slowed the truck as I approached, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But I was low on fuel and daylight was slipping away. I needed help, and it looked like the only option. The village had a strange quietness about it. You know how most small towns have some noise? Kids playing, dogs barking, radios on porches? Not here. Just an unsettling stillness. The houses were old, really old, like something out of a picture from the 1930s. The windows were cloudy, and the wood looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Then, out of nowhere, people started appearing. They stepped out of their houses slowly, their faces blank but polite, like they weren't used to visitors but were willing to tolerate me. A man with graying hair and a worn-out suit walked up to my truck and motioned for me to roll down the window. "Lost, aren't you?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm trying to get back to the highway. My GPS stopped working." He nodded like he'd heard the story before. "Come, you can stay the night. The roads get dangerous after dark around here." Something in his voice made me uneasy, but I was too tired to argue. Besides, the idea of getting back on those winding roads in the dark didn't sound appealing. They led me to a small boarding house, the kind that had probably seen its prime during the Great Depression. The woman running the place, Mrs. Granger, she said her name was, welcomed me in, but she, like the rest of them, had that same flat expression, like they were going through the motions of hospitality without actually feeling it. Her eyes, though, had a certain emptiness. As the sun dipped behind the hills, I decided to take a walk through the village. There was no cell service, and the landlines looked as old as everything else, so there wasn't much to do. The streets were all dirt, the kind that kicks up dust with every step. I didn't see any modern technology, no power lines, no cars, no TVs through the windows. It was like this place had been frozen in time, untouched by the modern world. I was about to turn back when I noticed a building set apart from the others. It was an old church, the kind with a steeple and peeling white paint. But it was abandoned, the windows shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. As I stood there, staring at it, I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was a melody. Faint, soft, but unmistakable. A choir singing from somewhere inside the church. I don't know why, but something compelled me to go inside. The air was colder the moment I crossed the threshold. The church was in complete disrepair. Pews overturned, dust thick in the air. But that singing, that eerie, distant song, filled the space. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest as I moved deeper into the church. And then I saw them. Faint shapes, barely visible, but there. Children, women, men, all standing in the aisles, their mouths open in song. Their bodies flickered like the light of a dying candle, translucent, trapped between here and somewhere else. They weren't looking at me. They didn't seem to even know I was there. I backed away slowly, my breath caught in my throat, and that's when I noticed the walls. They were covered in carvings, dates, names, some kind of language I couldn't understand. But the dates stood out to me. They went back over a century, and one word kept repeating itself, massacre. I ran out of there, heart pounding, and rushed back to the boarding house. Mrs. Granger was waiting for me, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked, not even looking up at me. "The song," I stammered. "What is that? Who are they?" She sighed, the first real emotion I'd seen from her since I arrived. "They're the ones we lost," she said softly. "From a time long ago. It's better not to ask too many questions. The village. We don't speak of it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of that haunting song echoing in my ears. I knew I had to leave, to get out of this place as soon as the sun came up. But when I climbed into my truck the next morning and drove, something strange happened. No matter which road I took, I always ended up back in the village. It was like the roads had turned in on themselves, looping endlessly, trapping me there. I drove for hours, until the fuel gauge hit empty and I was forced to stop. The villagers didn't seem surprised when I walked back into town. They didn't say a word, just watched me with those blank, knowing stares. I tried again the next day, and the next, but it was always the same. I couldn't leave. That's when it started to sink in. The village wasn't just forgotten. It was lost, cursed. The people who lived here weren't really living anymore. They were stuck, caught in a loop, bound by something I still can't explain. Weeks have passed now, or maybe it's been months. Time moves differently here. I still hear the singing at night. Sometimes, I think I see those ghostly figures walking through the streets, their eyes fixed on me, watching, waiting. I don't know how it happened or why, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never leaving this place. Just like them, I'm a part of the village now. Forever. Ninth story. The mystery of Hollow Creek. If I had known what Hollow Creek really was, I never would have convinced Josh to come. But at the time, it seemed like the perfect getaway. A quiet little village tucked away in southern Virginia, known for its scenic beauty and peaceful atmosphere. We were desperate to save our marriage, and the idea of escaping from everything, even for a few days, sounded like a lifeline. The first few hours were exactly what we needed. The town was picturesque, with winding roads and quaint houses surrounded by thick forests. The air was fresh, the locals were polite, if not a little distant, and there was something calming about being so far away from the noise of the city. But the longer we stayed, the more things started to feel off. It wasn't obvious at first. Just little things, the way the villagers would stare at us for a moment too long, or how conversations would trail off whenever we asked about the river. The river was the main attraction of the town, after all, winding through the woods just beyond the village. Crystal clear water, perfect for fishing or canoeing. But every time we mentioned going there, the locals would quickly change the subject or give us a warning smile. "Best to avoid the river at night," they'd say. "You never know what could happen." We shrugged it off. Small towns like Hollow Creek were full of superstitions, old wives' tales meant to keep kids in line or scare off outsiders. It was charming in a way, or at least that's what I thought until Josh started hearing the voice. We'd been at the inn for 2 days when it happened. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and we'd had another one of those silent dinners where neither of us knew what to say anymore. I was in bed, trying to convince myself that we could still fix things, when I heard Josh moving around by the window. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low, almost whispering. "Hear what?" I replied, sitting up and listening. There was nothing, just the soft rustling of the trees outside and the distant sound of the river. Josh didn't answer, but he kept staring out into the darkness, like he was waiting for something. After a while, he came back to bed, but I could tell something had changed. He seemed distant, distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. The next night, it happened again. I woke up to find him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Josh, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice tense, but he didn't answer, just pressed a finger to his lips and pointed toward the river. This time, I strained my ears, and I thought I heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of the water, but it was there, like a voice, distant and echoing, calling from the river. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did you hear that?" Josh whispered, his eyes wide. "Josh, come back to bed." "It's just the wind," I said, trying to convince myself more than him. But the way he looked at me, it was like he was hypnotized, like that sound was pulling him in, and nothing I said mattered. The next day, I told him we should leave, cut the trip short. Something about the village wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. But Josh insisted we stay. "It's just a couple more days," he said. "You're overthinking it," but I wasn't. That night, everything fell apart. We were both lying in bed when it happened again. The soft, beckoning voice, just beyond the trees, by the river. Only this time, it was louder, clearer, almost like it was calling his name. Josh shot up, grabbing his jacket before I even had a chance to stop him. "Josh, no," I begged, pulling at his arm. "You can't go out there. I have to know what it is," he muttered, his eyes locked on the window. "I just need to see." He wrenched free from my grip and stormed out the door. I ran after him, yelling for him to stop, but he didn't even look back. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, he was already disappearing into the trees, heading straight for the river. I stood there, heart pounding, staring after him until the cold, sinking feeling in my chest told me I wouldn't see him again. The minutes ticked by, then hours. I stood there, frozen, calling his name into the darkness. No answer. Nothing but the soft hum of the river and the faint, mocking echo of that voice, so familiar now. It was almost human. By dawn, I knew he was gone, and I knew the villagers knew it too. When I stumbled back into the town, covered in dirt and tears, they avoided my eyes. They knew, just like I did, what had happened. Desperate for answers, I started digging through old records at the local library. I thought maybe there'd been some kind of accident at the river, something that explained the disappearances, but what I found was worse. Much worse. The river had a history. The locals didn't talk about it, but Hollow Creek had always been cursed. Decades ago, a group of settlers had come through, only to disappear without a trace. The legend said the river was home to ancient spirits, souls of those long forgotten, who lured the living to their depths, trapping them beneath the water forever. Those who heard the voice were already marked. That's when I realized what had happened to Josh. He hadn't just disappeared, he'd been taken, drawn into the river by something far older, far darker than I could have imagined. I should have left. I should have run far away from Hollow Creek and never looked back. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave without him. The last night I spent in Hollow Creek, I went back to the river. I stood there on the bank, staring at the dark, rippling water, listening. First, there was nothing, just the sound of the current and the wind through the trees. But then I heard it, soft, barely audible but unmistakable, the voice. This time it was calling my name. I don't remember walking into the water. I don't remember the cold as it wrapped around my legs or the way the current tugged at my body, pulling me in deeper. All I remember is the voice, so sweet, so familiar, and I followed it. The water closed over my head, and everything went dark. That's the last thing I remember. If you ever find yourself in Hollow Creek, do yourself a favor. Don't listen to the river. And whatever you do, don't stay past sunset. Because once you hear the voice, it's already too late. Just like it was for me, and just like it was for Josh. 10th story, the dark farm of Briarville. Growing up in a small town like Briarville, Kansas, you get used to hearing all sorts of stories. Most of them are harmless. Local gossip, tales passed down over generations. But there's always that one story that lingers, the kind that no one talks about too openly. For us, it was the old Briar farm, sitting just on the edge of town. For as long as I could remember, people said it was abandoned, that it had been cursed after the last owners died under mysterious circumstances. No one dared to go near it, and over time it became more of a myth than an actual place. That is, until I found myself standing in front of it one cold autumn afternoon. I had just graduated from veterinary school and was eager to start my practice. Briarville was small, but it had a tight-knit community, and I figured it would be a good place to build my career. So when I got a call from a man claiming to live on the Briar farm, saying his horse was sick, I didn't think twice. I grabbed my kit and headed out, assuming it was just some prank, maybe one of the locals testing the new guy. But when I arrived, the farm was anything but abandoned. The first thing that struck me was the house. It was ancient, covered in peeling paint, the windows dark and lifeless. But there was smoke rising from the chimney, and a few animals, cows, goats, and horses, grazed in the fenced-off fields. The farm looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, yet here it was, fully functioning. A man stepped out onto the porch as I pulled up. He was tall, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes that gave him a haunted look. He didn't say much, just nodded toward the barn where the horse was. I got out of the truck, feeling a strange tension in the air, as if the place itself was watching me. I introduced myself, but he barely responded. His name was Jacob, and from what I could gather, he had lived there with his family for generations. But it wasn't just his silence that unnerved me. It was the way he moved, stiff, almost unnatural, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. When I got to the barn, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Inside, I found the horse, a large black stallion that looked like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its eyes were wide and wild, as if it were seeing things that weren't there. I knelt beside it, but as I reached out to examine the animal, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, like icy breath. I turned, but no one was there. Trying to shake off the feeling, I continued my work, but the deeper I went into the barn, the worse it got. I could hear whispering, faint, almost too quiet to understand, but definitely there. It was like a chorus of voices, overlapping each other, coming from the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but as the sun set and the barn grew darker, the voices got louder. By the time I finished with the horse, night had fallen, and the farm was bathed in an eerie glow from the moon. As I stepped outside, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: graves, dozens of them, scattered across the fields behind the house, marked with old, weathered stones. They were unkempt, overgrown with weeds, as if forgotten by time. Jacob was standing by the fence, staring at the graves with a blank expression. "Who's buried here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer at first, but after a long pause, he said quietly, "The Briars. They never left." I didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I finished up and told Jacob I'd come back to check on the horse the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, back at home, I couldn't sleep. The voices I'd heard in the barn kept playing over and over in my head. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next evening, I returned to the farm. I didn't want to, but something compelled me, like I needed to understand what was happening there. When I arrived, the farm was completely still. No animals, no sign of life. Just the old farmhouse looming in the distance, its dark windows staring down at me. I walked to the barn, but this time it felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, and the whispering started almost immediately. I could hear it all around me, the same overlapping voices, but now they were clearer. I could make out words, names, pleas, cries for help. And then I saw them, the animals, standing in the shadows of the barn, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. But they weren't just animals. There was something wrong with them, something unnatural. Their bodies twitched and jerked, as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. The horse, the same one I'd treated the day before, stood in the center, its eyes locked on mine. But it wasn't the horse looking at me. It was something else, someone else. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, But before I could leave, the barn doors slammed shut behind me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sickening certainty what Jacob had meant. The Briars had never left. They were still here, trapped in the bodies of the animals, bound to the land that had claimed them. The spirits of the old family, twisted by time and anger, had taken over the very creatures they once owned. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the barn or how I made it back to my truck, but I ran as fast as I could. When I looked back at the house, I saw Jacob standing on the porch, watching me with those same empty eyes. And behind him, the shadows of the animals moved, restless, waiting. I didn't make it far before the truck stalled. The engine died just as I reached the main road, and I could hear the animals approaching. Hooves, paws, claws, all of them moving in unison, like they were being led by something unseen. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to them close in. By the time the police arrived the next morning, I was gone. Vanished just like so many others before me. No one in Briarville talks about the Briar Farm anymore. The locals know better. But if you ever find yourself driving through Kansas and you see a lonely, old farmhouse on the horizon, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't stop. 11th story, the walls of Cedar Grove. When Sarah and I first moved to Cedar Grove, we thought we'd found paradise. Nestled deep in the forests of Pennsylvania, the village was everything we wanted. Quiet, picturesque, far removed from the stress of the city. The air was fresh, the people were kind, and the towering trees that surrounded the village gave it a sense of isolation that I found comforting. It felt like we were stepping into a simpler time, away from the chaos of modern life. But Cedar Grove had its secrets, and I learned that too late. The first thing we noticed after we settled in was the wall. It wasn't much, just a low, crumbling stone structure that encircled the oldest part of the village, where the more established families lived. From our small cottage on the outskirts, we could see it through the gaps in the trees. It wasn't tall, barely chest-high, and most of it was covered in moss and creeping ivy. Still, something about it felt off. I asked one of the locals, an elderly woman named Martha, about it one afternoon. Her reaction was immediate and unsettling. Her face tightened, and she gave me a look that was a mix of pity and warning. "The wall's been there longer than any of us," she said quickly, her voice low. "Best not to ask too many questions." That was it. No explanation, no details. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling like I'd overstepped some unspoken boundary. Sarah didn't think much of it. "Small towns have their quirks," she said, brushing it off as nothing more than local superstition. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why was no one talking about it? Why did the older residents seem to avoid looking at it? More importantly, why did no one ever cross it? It wasn't long before I noticed the strange behavior of the villagers. At dusk, the streets would empty out. No one walked their dogs. No one gathered on their porches for evening drinks. As soon as the sun started to set, the doors would lock, and the lights in the windows would flicker out. The town became a ghost village every night, with only the occasional flicker of a lantern behind drawn curtains. One night, out of sheer curiosity, I stayed up late, watching from the front porch. The village was deathly silent, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like the distant rumble of something heavy being dragged through the forest. It was faint, but there was something about it that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the wind. I couldn't sleep after that. The sound played over and over in my mind, gnawing at me, and the wall became an obsession. What was on the other side? Why did no one ever cross it? Sarah thought I was overthinking things. "You're turning this into one of your stories," she said, smiling as she brushed my hair back one morning. "We're supposed to be relaxing here, remember?" But I couldn't let it go. I started spending more time walking near the wall, studying it, searching for any clue that might explain why it was there. The stones were old, weathered, and strangely cold to the touch, even on warm days. And then I noticed something peculiar. There were no gates, no breaks in the wall, no paths leading through it. It was as if it had been built not to let anything out or in. That's when I started asking around. Most of the villagers were tight-lipped, avoiding the subject entirely. But after weeks of persistence, I found someone willing to talk. It was a young man, probably in his early 20s, who had grown up in Cedar Grove. We were sitting at the local bar, and after a few drinks, his tongue loosened. "They don't like to talk about it," he said, glancing nervously around the room. "The wall's been here since the village was founded. My granddad told me stories when I was a kid, said it was built to keep something in the woods, something ancient." I pressed him for more, but he clammed up after that, muttering something about needing to get home before dark. That night, I made a decision. I had to see what was on the other side of the wall. Sarah begged me not to go. She'd noticed the change in me, the way I'd become obsessed with the wall, and she was worried. But I couldn't stop. I needed to know. I waited until after midnight, when the village was silent, and crept out with a flashlight and a pair of hiking boots. I made my way through the woods to the wall, where the forest was thickest, and climbed over. My heart was pounding as I dropped down on the other side, the air colder and heavier than it had been moments before. At first, there was nothing unusual, just more forest, dense and dark, the trees twisted in strange, unnatural shapes. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, that sound returned. The same low, rumbling drag I'd heard from my porch, only now it was closer. It felt like it was coming from all around me, vibrating through the earth beneath my feet. Then I saw it. In a clearing ahead, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight, stood a creature unlike anything I had ever imagined. Its form was grotesque, a mass of misshapen limbs and leathery skin that seemed to ripple as it moved. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were sunken pits of darkness, and its mouth, a gaping maw filled with teeth that glistened in the light. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. The creature turned toward me, its movements slow, deliberate, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I ran. Branches clawed at my face. My legs burned with every step, but I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its body dragging through the underbrush, getting closer. My lungs screamed for air as I reached the wall, scrambling to climb over. But when I reached the top, I stopped cold. On the other side, the villagers were there, dozens of them, standing silently in the moonlight watching me. Their faces were blank, emotionless, like they had been expecting this. I yelled for help, begged them to let me back in, but they didn't move. That's when I realized the wall wasn't there to keep something out. It was to keep me in. They knew. They always knew. The moment you cross the wall, you're marked. You've seen too much, and now you don't get to leave. The creature's breathing was right behind me now. I could feel its presence, looming, waiting. I'm not sure what will happen next, but if you ever come to Cedar Grove, do yourself a favor. Don't ask about the wall. Don't cross it. And if you hear the sound at night, stay inside. It's already too late for me. 12th story. The trustee of Maple Hill. I've handled some strange cases before, but nothing like Maple Hill. When my firm assigned me to investigate a series of anonymous complaints about this tiny, isolated village in Colorado, I thought it would be just another routine case. A couple of interviews, some paperwork, and I'd be back home within a week. Couldn't have been more wrong. Maple Hill isn't on most maps. It's the kind of place you have to know about to find. Tucked away in the mountains, surrounded by thick forests and winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The town itself was quaint, charming, even like a snapshot of a simpler time. People there smiled and waved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was this undercurrent, an unease in their eyes that their friendly words couldn't hide. The complaints I was sent to investigate were vague. Missing people, strange noises at night, odd occurrences that couldn't easily be explained. The letters weren't signed, but they all mentioned the same name, the trustee of Maple Hill. I assumed it was some kind of local government position, a figurehead or caretaker responsible for overseeing the town. But the way people talked about him or didn't made me curious. Every time I asked about the trustee, the conversation shifted. People became tight-lipped, their smiles fading just slightly. "He keeps things in order," they would say, as if that explained everything. When I pressed for more, they grew nervous, glancing around like they were afraid of being overheard. "You don't ask about the trustee," one old man muttered before quickly excusing himself. After a few days, I started to notice things. At first, it was small, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, the sensation of being watched when no one was around. The villagers seemed friendly enough during the day, but at night, the streets were deserted, and the town took on a different character. The air grew thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the creak of a door swinging shut. And always looming at the edge of my awareness was the house on the hill, the trustee's house. It stood at the highest point of the village, overlooking everything like a sentinel. It was larger than the other homes, older with dark, weathered wood and windows that seemed to watch you as you passed. No one lived there, at least not openly. I never saw anyone come or go, but the house radiated authority, a presence that you couldn't ignore. The villagers never spoke of it, but their eyes often darted toward the hill when they thought no one was looking. I knew I had to get inside. After days of stonewalling from the locals, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Late one night, I made my way up to the house, armed with nothing more than a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The path was overgrown, as if it hadn't been used in years, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt, large, heavy. Someone had been there recently. The door creaked open without resistance, and I stepped into the cold, musty air of the house. The inside was sparse, almost like no one truly lived there. Dust coated the floor, and the furniture looked untouched. But there was something else, too. Presence. I could feel it, watching, waiting. As I moved through the house, I found a study, cluttered with old documents and ledgers. The papers were yellowed with age, but they told a story, a dark one. The trustee had been in Maple Hill for far longer than should have been possible. The documents dated back over 100 years, and yet the same signature appeared again and again. Trustee. No names, just that title, always the same hand. That's when I found the ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was filled with names, dates, and a single word beside each: sacrificed. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped through the pages, recognizing some of the names. They were the people who had gone missing. The anonymous complaints weren't just rumors, they were warnings. And at the top of each list, the date matched the letters I'd received. I had to leave. I had to get out of Maple Hill. But as I turned to go, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on the stairs. The trustee. He was coming. I rushed out of the house and back down the hill, my mind racing. Who or what was this trustee? And why did the villagers fear him so much? I didn't have time to think. I had to get to my car, get out of this cursed town, and never look back. But as I reached the village square, the streets were no longer empty. The villagers were waiting. They stood in silence, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They knew. They had always known. The trustee wasn't just a figure of authority. He was something else, something ancient, and they were complicit in his reign. Before I could react, hands grabbed me from behind, dragging me to the ground. I struggled, but there were too many of them. They carried me back up the hill toward the house, where the trustee was waiting. He was tall, impossibly tall, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold, calculating. He didn't speak, but I could hear his voice in my mind, a whispering, insidious presence that filled every corner of my thoughts. "You're here to keep the order," he said, his voice like rustling leaves on a windless night. The village requires balance, and you will give it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in his gaze. The villagers stood around us, silent and obedient, as if they were used to this, as if they had seen it all before. I realized then what had happened. The trustee wasn't just one man, he was every man. Every generation, a new trustee was chosen, bound to the village by a pact that kept it prosperous, kept it safe. But the price was blood. The price was sacrifice. And now it was my turn. They dragged me into the house, into the cold, dark cellar beneath the floorboards. The walls were lined with names, scrawled in chalk, stretching back over a century. And at the very top, in fresh white letters, was my name, Lucas. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was alone in the house, the villagers gone, the air still and quiet. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the house seemed to pulse with life around me. I was the trustee now. The village needed me and I couldn't leave. No one could. The cycle had to continue. The sacrifices had to be made. I've been in Maple Hill ever since. I watch over the village, ensuring that everything runs smoothly, that the order is maintained. The villagers smile at me now, with that same hollow look in their eyes. They know what I've become, and one day, when the time comes, I'll find my replacement. Because Maple Hill always requires a trustee. 13th story, the echo of Brighton Springs. When I first arrived in Brighton Springs, it felt like the perfect place to start over. After losing Rob, I needed to get away from the noise of the city, from the constant reminders of his absence. Brighton Springs, nestled in the quiet mountains of Nevada, promised peace. The village was known for its hot springs, famous, they said, for their healing properties. People traveled for miles around to soak in the mineral-rich waters, hoping to find some relief from the aches and pains of life. I came looking for something different. The villagers were kind, but distant. They welcomed me in that polite, small-town way, offering smiles but keeping their distance. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to heal, to forget. First, everything seemed normal. The days were quiet, spent exploring the trails that wound around the village or sitting by the springs, staring out at the mist that seemed to hang perpetually over the water. But the nights were different. At night, when the village was still and the wind blew through the mountains, you could hear them. The echoes. I didn't think much of it at first. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, bouncing off the mountains and creating strange sounds. But it wasn't long before I started hearing something more than just the wind. Whispers. Faint, indistinct voices carried on the breeze. Sometimes it was just a word, other times it was a low murmur that seemed to come from all directions. The villagers didn't talk about it. I asked a few of them, casually, if they ever heard strange sounds at night, but they would just shrug and change the subject. After a while, I stopped asking, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more persistent. And one night I heard him, Rob's voice. It was unmistakable. That deep, calming tone I knew so well, calling my name like he used to when he'd come home from work. I shot out of bed, my heart racing, and ran outside, expecting, what exactly? That he would be standing there waiting for me? But there was nothing, just the empty street and the thick silence of the night. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I'd heard my dead husband's voice calling me in the middle of the night? I would have sounded insane. But the next night it happened again. This time I could make out the words. He was calling me, asking me to come find him. For the first few nights I tried to ignore it. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Grief does strange things to people, but the more I ignored it, the louder the voices became. Not just Rob's, others too. Voices I didn't recognize, all calling out, pleading, whispering things I didn't understand. I started walking at night, wandering the streets and the trails that led up into the mountains, hoping to clear my head. But everywhere I went, I could hear them. The voices seemed to echo off the rocks, bouncing back at me from all directions. Some nights, it was so loud it felt like they were right beside me, breathing down my neck. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. One evening, after another sleepless night, I went to the town library and started digging into the local history. That's when I found the stories, the myths about the springs. It was said that long ago, people used to drown in the hot springs. Some were accidents, but others were suicides, people overwhelmed by despair, who walked into the water hoping for peace. The legend said that the springs had a way of absorbing the souls of those who died in them, trapping them beneath the surface. And at night, those souls would speak. I didn't want to believe it. I'm a doctor, a woman of science. I don't believe in ghosts or ancient curses. But the more I read, the more it made sense. The voices, the way they called to me, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. I became obsessed. I needed to know if it was truly Rob. If somehow his soul had found its way here, to this strange, forgotten place. One night, the voices were louder than ever. Rob's voice was so clear, I could practically feel him next to me. "Heather, please. I need you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. He was begging me to come to the springs. I couldn't ignore him anymore. I grabbed my jacket and left the house, following the sound of his voice through the darkened village. The streets were empty, the moon barely lighting the path ahead of me. I walked toward the springs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, the water was still, covered in a thick layer of mist. The air around me was heavy with moisture, and the smell of the minerals was overpowering. But the voices were there, louder than ever, swirling around me like a choir of the dead. And then I saw it, a figure in the mist, standing at the edge of the water. Rob. He looked just like I remembered, tall, with his broad shoulders and that familiar, soft smile. He reached out his hand toward me. "Come with me, Heather," he said. "I've been waiting for you." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, to feel his arms around me again. But something stopped me. A cold dread crept up my spine. This wasn't right. This couldn't be real. I took a step back, and as I did, Rob's face changed. His eyes darkened, his smile twisting into something cold, something wrong. The other voices grew louder, angrier, and I realized too late what was happening. They weren't just calling to me, they were luring me. I tried to turn, to run, but the mist around the springs thickened, wrapping around me like 1,000 cold hands. The voices rose to a deafening roar, and I felt something pulling me toward the water. I fought, but it was no use. The force was too strong. As I was dragged toward the edge of the spring, I saw them. Figures in the water, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes wide with sorrow. They were the ones who had drowned here, the souls trapped beneath the surface. And now they wanted me. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. The last thing I remember before the water closed over my head was Rob's voice. No longer pleading, but laughing, cold, empty laughter that echoed in my mind. Now I'm part of the echo. I don't know how long I've been here, but I can feel the others around me, their voices mingling with mine, calling out to anyone who dares to listen. We're all trapped, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. If you ever find yourself in Brighton Springs, and you hear someone calling your name in the night, don't follow the voice. Don't listen, or you'll end up like me, a part of the echo. Fourth story, the Church of St. Elms. When I first arrived in St. Elms, Ohio, I didn't expect much beyond a sleepy village with some interesting architecture. As a photographer, I'd been drawn to the town by whispers about its Gothic church, a towering, weathered structure that dominated the landscape, standing out against the rolling fields and scattered homes. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it in the photos I'd seen online. The way it loomed over the village, casting long shadows even on the brightest days, felt like an invitation to capture something truly unique. What the pictures didn't show was the eerie silence that clung to the place. St. Elm's felt forgotten. The streets were empty, the houses worn down, and even the air seemed thick with something I couldn't quite put into words. But I wasn't there to be scared, I was there to work. I checked into the only inn in town, a small, run-down place run by an old woman who barely looked me in the eye when she handed me the keys. "The church is closed at night," she muttered, almost as if it were an afterthought. I hadn't even asked about it. I smiled politely, nodding, but her words stuck with me. It was strange how everyone seemed reluctant to talk about the very thing that put their town on the map. Still, I brushed it off as small-town superstition. Every old place had its local legends, and St. Elm's was no different. That evening, I wandered the village with my camera, capturing the crumbling facades, the overgrown paths, and, of course, the church. Up close, it was even more imposing. Its stone walls covered in ivy, with gargoyles perched high above, staring down as if they knew something I didn't. I could feel the weight of history in every crack and crevice. There was a plaque near the front, worn and barely legible, marking the church as a remnant of the 1800s. As I lined up a shot of the bell tower, a soft voice interrupted me. "Are you here for the bell?" I turned to see a man, probably in his 60s, standing a few feet away. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, watching me with a mix of curiosity and caution. "The bell?" I asked, lowering my camera. "Midnight," he said, taking a step closer. "Once a year, it rings on its own, and someone disappears." I blinked, unsure if he was messing with me or not, but his expression didn't change. "Who disappears?" "Anyone. A villager, a visitor, it doesn't matter. It happens like clockwork. Always the same night, always after the bell rings." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "People around here don't like to talk about it." Before I could ask more, he walked away, leaving me standing there with a chill creeping up my spine. It had to be some local legend, right? Another spooky story meant to keep tourists entertained. But as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Later that night, as I sat in my room editing photos, I heard it. The bell. A single, deep toll that echoed through the village. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. I wasn't even sure it was real at first, but then it came again. Slowly, deliberately, each toll seemed to vibrate in my bones, pulling me toward the window. I pushed the curtains aside and looked out, half expecting to see something, anything, that could explain the noise. But the streets were empty, and the church stood silent, its bell tower illuminated by the pale moonlight. Something was pulling me to it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was foolishness, but I grabbed my camera and jacket, slipping out into the cool night air. The village was deathly quiet as I made my way toward the church, the sound of the bell still ringing in my ears, though it had long since stopped. The heavy wooden doors creaked as I pushed them open, the musty air of the church rushing out to meet me. Inside, the pews were lined with dust, and the altar stood eerily untouched, as if frozen in time. My footsteps echoed in the vast space as I made my way toward the front, scanning the dark corners for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. A faint glow coming from a side door, partially hidden behind the altar. My heart raced as I moved toward it, the soft flicker of candlelight growing stronger. I hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, and lined with stone walls. In the center stood a group of people, all dressed in dark robes, their heads bowed in silence. First, they didn't notice me. I thought maybe I'd stumbled onto some kind of secret service, a midnight prayer group or something. But then one of them turned, and I saw the knife. Panic surged through me as I realized what I was seeing. A man, bound and gagged, lay on the stone floor in the middle of the group, his eyes wide with terror. One of the robed figures was holding the knife above him, chanting something under their breath. My mind raced as I backed away, but the door behind me slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Before I could react, hands grabbed me from behind, yanking me forward. My camera slipped from my grasp, crashing to the floor with a sickening crack. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the thick stone walls of the church. The group surrounded me, their faces hidden by their hoods, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold, indifferent. The chanting grew louder, the air thick with the scent of burning incense and something else, something metallic. My heart pounded in my chest as they forced me to my knees, binding my hands. I fought, but it was useless. They were stronger than they looked. One of them stepped forward, lowering their hood. It was the old woman from the inn. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice calm, almost regretful. "The bell calls for a sacrifice. It always has. We must keep the village pure." I shook my head, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't real, couldn't be real. But the knife in her hand, the fear in the bound man's eyes, it was all too real. The last thing I remember is the cold blade against my skin and the sound of the bell, tolling one final time. The next morning, St. Elm's was quiet again, just like it always was. The villagers went about their day as if nothing had happened, as if I'd never been there. My name is Lucy, and I've joined the countless others who disappeared after the bell rang in St. Elm's. And the church still stands, waiting for its next sacrifice. Fifth story, the residents of Hollow Point. I thought Hollow Point would be the perfect escape. I'd spent years traveling, studying geological formations and natural phenomena across the country. So when the opportunity arose to spend a few months in a quiet, forgotten village in the heart of Oklahoma, I jumped at it. There were rumors, of course, there always are about places like this. Some people said Hollow Point had been cursed, others swore it was haunted. But as a man of science, I dismissed the stories as local folklore. First, the village was small, so small that if you blinked while driving down the main road, you might miss it entirely. I arrived on a hot, dry afternoon. The air smelled faintly of dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Hollow Point had a certain charm, like it was stuck in time. Quaint houses lined the main street with picket fences and neatly kept lawns. But the strangest thing wasn't the village's old-fashioned look. It was the people. From the moment I set foot in Hollow Point, I noticed something peculiar. Every person I encountered seemed to be watching me, but not in a curious, welcoming way. Their eyes followed me, cold and calculating, as if they were sizing me up for something. It wasn't until later that I would understand what that something was. My first week there, I tried to blend in. I was there to study a series of sinkholes that had appeared in the nearby fields, a strange but natural occurrence, or so I thought. I rented a small house near the edge of the village and went about my work. The villagers kept their distance, but I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. But then, I started noticing things. One evening, while I was at the village's only diner, I overheard a conversation that sent a chill down my spine. Two older women were talking at a nearby table, their voices hushed but urgent. "He's gone now," one of them whispered. The other woman nodded solemnly. "She'll be here soon." It's always so quick. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming they were talking about a neighbor moving away or maybe even a funeral. But when I asked the waitress about it, she just smiled at me. A tight, forced smile, and changed the subject. It wasn't until the next day that I learned what they had meant. Hollow Point had exactly 100 residents. I hadn't realized it at first, but once I did, it became obvious. I saw the same faces over and over again, at the diner, at the grocery store, walking along the dusty streets. Always 100, not a person more, not a person less. Then one morning, as I was getting coffee at the small cafe, I overheard the news that one of the older men in town, Mr. Garrison, had died in his sleep the night before. The cafe was abuzz with whispers, But again, something about the way the townspeople spoke unsettled me. No one seemed sad or even surprised. It was more like anticipation. Later that day, I saw her, a new resident. She was a woman in her 30s, dressed in simple clothes, standing awkwardly outside a house I hadn't noticed before. One of the villagers, a man I'd seen countless times but never spoken to, was leading her inside, talking to her in a low voice. She didn't look like she knew where she was, as if she'd just appeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying everything I'd seen and heard. 100 residents. No more, no less. A man dies, and suddenly, a new person shows up without explanation. I needed answers. I started asking questions, discreetly at first. But the more I pressed, the more hostile the villagers became. They stopped acknowledging me on the street, their eyes following me in silence. Even the people I had spoken to before were cold now, distant. Then the accident happened. A young man named Kyle, one of the few people in Hollow Point who had actually smiled at me, was hit by a truck while crossing the street. He died instantly, and just like that, the cycle began again. The whispers, the anticipation, the eerie calm. The next morning, there was a new face in town, another replacement. It was then that I realized the truth. The village wasn't just small, it was trapped. For some reason, whether a curse, a pact, or something far darker, Hollow Point was bound to its 100 residents. When one person died, another took their place, as if the village itself demanded it. I knew I had to leave, but by then it was too late. The night after Kyle's death, I began to feel a strange pressure, as if the village itself was watching me. The stares from the villagers were no longer passive, they were expectant. And then I overheard it. Standing outside my house, in the stillness of the night, I heard voices, soft, deliberate. It's his turn. They're always new here for a reason. I froze, my blood running cold. They were talking about me. I packed what little I had and made for my truck, praying I could escape before it was too late. But when I reached the edge of town, something was wrong. The road that had led me in seemed to twist and turn back on itself, leading me back to the village no matter which direction I took. Hollow Point wouldn't let me go. When I returned to my house, defeated and exhausted, they were waiting. The entire village, standing in the street, their faces emotionless, blank. They surrounded me, slowly closing in. And then I saw him, Kyle. He was standing at the front of the crowd, his face pale, his eyes distant. But it wasn't Kyle anymore. Not really. The people of Hollow Point didn't speak as they led me to the town square. They didn't have to. I knew what was happening. I was being welcomed, just as the others before me had been. I was no longer an outsider. I was part of the 100. I'm writing this now from a house that isn't mine but soon will be. A house I'll never leave. The villagers, my neighbors now, walk by, glancing at me through the windows, waiting for the inevitable moment when I'll be replaced, just like all the others. If you ever find yourself passing through a quiet village called Hollow Point, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Because once you cross that line, you won't be going anywhere. And there will always be 100 of us.